The winter I remember best began with silence, the kind that settles so deep it feels like the world has decided not to breathe anymore. Snow had buried the trail outside Black Willow like a secret too heavy to carry forward, smoothing over every hoofprint, every mistake. I stood at the edge of that quiet once, long ago, watching a man named Silas Crow lower his head as if the sky itself had pressed him down. The wind worried at his coat, and the grave at his feet was no more than a wooden marker leaning into the frost, already surrendering to time. Jonah Crow lay beneath that snow. He had been Silas's shadow since boyhood, laughing louder, trusting easier, always believing the world would soften if you met it halfway. It did not. Winter fever took him quick, stealing the color from his cheeks and the steadiness from his breath, leaving Silas to keep watch in a bunkhouse that smelled of pine smoke and fear. Jonah had known he was dying. Men do, sometimes. He'd reached out with a hand that shook like a leaf caught between seasons and closed his fingers around Silas's wrist, holding tight as though grip alone could bargain with the dark. "Promise me," Jonah had whispered, voice thin as the ice forming along the window seams. Silas leaned in, nodding because nodding was easier than asking what kind of promise costs a man sleep. Jonah swallowed, eyes searching the ceiling like it might answer for him. "She won't make it alone. Marry her. Don't let her be left." Silas said yes before the words could weigh him down. He said it because love has a way of turning into obligation when death is nearby. Jonah smiled then, just once, as if the knot in his chest had loosened, and by morning the bunkhouse was quieter than it had ever been. The promise, though, stayed loud. It followed Silas out into the snow, sat beside him at the grave, and pressed against his ribs each time the wind cut sharp. The woman Jonah had met lived at the edge of Black Willow, beyond where the road pretended to end. Folks spoke her name with lowered voices, when they spoke it at all. Maeve Holloway. She had scars that caught the eye and held it, pale lines across her cheek, and throat like the memory of fire refusing to fade. Poverty clung to her as stubbornly as the cold, and yet there was a straightness to the way she stood, a refusal to bow even when the world gave her every reason to. Silas first saw her mending a fence post that leaned like an old drunk toward the snow. Her gloves were thin, her hands steady. She worked without hurry, as if time answered to her instead of the other way around. He watched from a distance, unsure whether to announce himself or keep moving, and felt the promise tighten. Town gossip had taught him what to expect. Pity sharpened into cruelty, judgment disguised as concern. None of it prepared him for the way Maeve looked up and met his gaze, without flinching. He told her about Jonah. Not everything, just enough to place the weight between them. The promise slipped out awkwardly, a confession he hadn't practiced. He spoke of marriage like a man describing a storm he hoped might pass him by. Maeve listened, eyes unreadable, then shook her head once, slow and deliberate. She said she did not need saving, did not want charity dressed up as devotion. Jonah had been kind, she allowed, and kindness did not obligate the living to sacrifice themselves on its behalf. Her voice never rose. That was the hardest part. Silas left then, feeling smaller for having come. The snow seemed deeper on the walk back, each step an effort. Black Willow greeted him with its usual indifference. Etta Bloom paused mid-sentence in the dry goods store when he entered, her eyes bright with the thrill of something new to discuss once he was gone. The sheriff offered a nod that carried both warning and sympathy. Silas took work where he could, mending tack, hauling feed, anything to keep his hands busy and his thoughts at bay. Yet the promise refused to be ignored. He found himself walking past Maeve's place at dusk, leaving a sack of flour where it might be discovered without conversation. He fixed the hinge on her door while she was gone, set right a shutter that rattled all night. These were small acts, easily overlooked, but they carried more truth than the words he'd stumbled over before. Maeve noticed. She did not thank him. She did not invite him in. She simply let the repairs stand, as if acknowledging that help offered quietly was different from help demanded. Winter tightened its grip. The river crusted over, and the air tasted like iron. Town gatherings grew fewer, then smaller, until only the bold or the desperate ventured out after dark. When Maeve appeared at the general store, Conversation dipped and twisted around her like smoke avoiding a draft. Silas felt the looks land on him too, measuring, weighing. Sheriff Amos Ridge pulled him aside one evening, voice low. "People notice who you stand with," he said, not unkindly. Silas nodded, because he did. What surprised him was not the town's judgment, but his own persistence. He began to understand that the promise had changed shape. It was no longer Jonah's dying wish echoing in his ear, but something quieter, steadier. He brought firewood and stacked it without being asked. He learned the rhythm of Maeve's days, the way she paused before speaking, the strength it took to let anyone close. When she spoke of the fire that had taken her family, she did so plainly, without seeking sympathy. Silas listened, the world narrowing to the sound of her voice and the crackle of ice underfoot. There were nights they sat by separate fires, close enough to feel the other's presence, far enough to keep their solitude intact. Snow fell thick and soundless between them, turning the dark into something soft. Silas would watch the glow from Maeve's window and wonder when duty had given way to choice, when respect had grown roots deeper than obligation. He did not know what would come next. He only knew that winter had not broken either of them yet, and that sometimes endurance is its own kind of promise. When the coldest night came, the one where even the stars seemed to retreat, Silas stood outside, breath clouding, and felt the pull of a future he had not planned. The town slept, the snow kept its counsel, and two fires burned on opposite sides of the same frozen yard, waiting for morning. Winter did not loosen its hold when morning came. It merely shifted its weight. The snow remained, but something between Silas Crow and Maeve Holloway had begun to move, slow as thawing ground. They worked side by side now, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two people who understood that survival was a shared language. Silas learned the sound of Maeve's footsteps in the dark, the way she paused before opening a door, measuring the world beyond it. Maeve learned the quiet in Silas, how his silences were not empty but careful, shaped by years of carrying what could not be spoken aloud. He never pressed her. The promise that had once felt like a chain had softened into something like patience. When he brought supplies, he did so openly, meeting her eyes, accepting her nod as enough. When the wind cut cruel and the fire burned low, they sat together without filling the air with unnecessary words. Their closeness grew not from declarations, but from the steadiness of showing up, again and again, until presence itself became reassurance. The town noticed, as towns always do. Etta Bloom's glances sharpened, and conversations bent away from Maeve like grass under frost. At Sunday service, a space opened around her that no one claimed, a ring of absence that spoke louder than refusal. Silas took the seat beside her, without hesitation. He felt the looks, the weight of them, but he did not move. Maeve's hands trembled once, then stilled. She did not thank him. She did not need to. It was on a night thick with falling snow that Maeve finally told him the rest. The fire had taken her parents and the roof over her head in the same hour, leaving scars that were easier to point at than the grief that followed. People had offered help then too, she said, but only on terms that required her to bend, to be smaller than she was. She had chosen hunger over humiliation, solitude over debt that came with strings. Silas listened, understanding that her strength was not forged in isolation, but in the refusal to let suffering define her worth. The decision, when it came, surprised them both in its simplicity. There was no moment of thunder or revelation, only a morning when Silas realized he was no longer acting from Jonah's shadow. The promise had brought him to this place, but it did not command him anymore. He wanted Maeve not because he had sworn to, but because the days felt incomplete without her steady presence. When he asked her to marry him, his voice did not rise or falter. He spoke as one speaks of facts that cannot be denied. Maeve did not answer at once. She walked the length of the yard, boots crunching through crusted snow, and stopped where the fence met the open land. Silas waited, hands empty, ready to accept whatever she chose. When she turned back, there was no softness in her eyes, only resolve. She said yes the way she did everything else, without ornament, without apology. The wedding was as spare as the season. A few witnesses, breath fogging the air, vows carried on the wind. Sheriff Ridge tipped his hat, a small gesture that carried more weight than any speech. The town watched from a distance, some with curiosity, others with disapproval that had begun to lose its edge. Maeve stood straight, scars uncovered, meeting every gaze, without flinching. Silas felt something in him settle, a sense that he had finally stepped into his own skin. Life did not change all at once. Gossip does not vanish simply because it is tired, but it softened, worn down by the steady proof of a partnership that asked nothing of the town. Maeve worked, Silas worked, and together they built a life that did not rely on acceptance to be whole. Winter eventually gave way, as it always does, and the thaw revealed ground that had been waiting patiently beneath the ice. I tell you this not because it was extraordinary, but because it was earned. Strength, I learned, is not found in grand gestures or loud defiance, but in the quiet courage to stand where you choose, again and again, until the world adjusts around you. Love is not rescue, nor is it sacrifice. It is the daily decision to meet another person without trying to change their shape. If this story has warmed something in you, if it has reminded you that dignity can grow even in the hardest seasons, then stay a while longer. Walk these old trails with us again. Subscribe, and let the next tale find you when the fire burns low and the night feels long.